I was a teacher for 10 years, a high school teacher of English before becoming a researcher and studying with Rob Coe and Steve Higgins at Durham University. And throughout my career, I've been interested in what constitutes effective teaching practice. What are the things that great teachers, highly effective teachers know and do and believe? And that's what we're going to dig into today. We're going to try to answer this question, what makes great teaching, by looking at the research evidence from around the world on the knowledge, skills, understanding, attitudes and beliefs that seem to be associated with teachers whose students learn more. You're very welcome today. I'd like to just do a couple of housekeeping announcements. First of all, I'm going to invite questions during the course of the webinar, and please put these questions into the chat box. I'll also pause a couple of times very briefly if you'd like to put questions into the chat box. And my colleague, Kate Jones, is very kindly helping me out today. There's Kate, I think, and she'll be curating the questions, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. The other bit of housekeeping is just to say that there will be some QR codes that I put into the presentation as a way of linking out to other useful resources. So if you've got a device that you can use to take a snap of those QR codes, then I'd suggest you prepare it now, because the first of the QR codes will come up in just a few moments' time. Okay, let's get started then. Let's start digging in. So in terms of like the outline for today, we're going to focus on thinking about the best bet areas for teachers to improve their practice. You know, research can't tell teachers what to do, but it can start to shed light on some of the areas that are probably worth spending that valuable time and attention that teachers have. And then secondly, we're going to try and think a little bit about what school leaders can do in the environment in which teachers work to help them to improve their practice. So we'll just think briefly about some of the conditions that seem to be associated with teachers getting better at teaching. But let's start with a fundamental question. In a school, in a college, wherever you are, what makes most difference to how much students learn? What's the thing that can have the biggest impact over which we in schools have some kind of control? And the answer that we find when we look at the best available research evidence is quality teaching. It's about having the biggest impact in the classroom by helping every teacher to be a little bit better every day, every lesson, with every class that they teach. And here at EBE, we contend that really the only way to improve teacher quality at scale is really to help every teacher to get better in the things that matter most to the students that they teach right now. And this isn't about ranking teachers in order of effectiveness or something like that, but helping every single teacher to get a little bit better than they currently are, given their starting point, no matter what their starting point is. Learning is learning, whether you're a child in a classroom or an adult engaging in professional learning. So we need to start with teachers where they are and help them to be a little bit better than they currently are. So this leads us on then to try and answer the question, well, what makes a great teacher? What are the kind of, again, these sort of constituent parts? And lots of people have lots of different ways of answering this question, but I'm going to give you mine, simply by acknowledging that some teachers, yes, are more effective than others. And that the differences between the most effective teachers and the least effective are large, and that they can be really impactful for the students that they teach. So is the status quo that we have good enough in our schools and colleges? Well, to a certain extent, yes, and to some extent, no. Yes, because everybody is working really hard. Teachers are trying to do their best and they're achieving great things. But no, because we can always be better. There's no threshold at which performance becomes good enough in teaching. So our standard really should apply to our commitment and direction of travel, not to status. It's about trying to be a little bit better next year than we are this year. It's about a commitment to a direction of travel, not about status. So let's dig into thinking then about those best bets for teachers. What are the things that teachers could work on that seem to be most likely to be associated with improving students' learning? We've got lots of choices, but where can we place our decisions to get the maximum impact? And before we look at that, it's worth acknowledging that it's really common to hear people claim that they know good teaching when they see it. But it's really difficult, even for highly experienced teachers, to distinguish between the most effective and least effective in classroom practice. So it's important that we start with some kind of common shared language of teaching to act as a starting point for conversations about how we get better. And as Dylan has pointed out, research evidence can't tell us what to do as teachers. It's far too complex for that, but it can identify some best bets. And we identified those best bets back in 2020. And we put them into a document that we called the Great Teaching Toolkit Evidence Review. And the QR code that I put up before is the one that will take you to that evidence review, but also I'll link to it again towards the end of this presentation. And the evidence review is available in a whole host of languages, in Mandarin and Spanish, and Portuguese, and all kinds. And it simply gives us an overview of what the research evidence tells us about the things that really highly effective teachers know, do, and believe. And that's what we're going to dig into today. So when we conducted this review, we found that the evidence was speaking towards 4 key areas, or as we call them, 4 dimensions of great teaching. And so this is the overview of the model that we created, this what we call a model for great teaching. And we're going to go into a little bit of depth on each of these shortly. But as an overview, I don't think any of these are really often surprising to most teachers. Understanding the content, really knowing your stuff, creating an environment that is supportive for learning, managing the classroom in ways that use every single opportunity that a child has to learn, and then doing things in the classroom using explanations and questions and practice activities that engage students in thinking really hard about the things that we want them to learn. So we have these 4 broad categories, and those broad categories then seem to divide down into what we call 17 elements of great teaching. And we kind of think of this really as a bit of a curriculum for teacher learning. So we break these 4 areas down in understanding the content, creating a supportive environment, maximizing opportunity to learn, and activating hard thinking into these little elements, which themselves have kind of smaller granular points within them. And it's these things that we're going to dig into today. And we'll go through section by section, thinking a little bit about, well, what does the evidence tell us, and what might some classroom examples look like if teachers were doing things that were kind of evidence-based practice and trying to improve in ways that are most likely to help students' learning. So let's start with this first one, understanding the content. Great teachers understand the content that they're teaching, but they also understand how it's learned. And this is I think, a crucial distinction. Yes, as an English teacher, I was expected to know all about the text that I was teaching, the grammar that I was teaching that students were supposed to learn, and so on and so on. But I also needed to learn something about how those students experienced the learning of those things, the common misconceptions that they have, having lots and lots of different ways of explaining concepts in English literature are key facets of this. And when we break down this idea of understanding the content, we have these 4 separate elements of great teaching. And number 1 is really about that deep and fluent and flexible knowledge of the content that we're teaching. Secondly, as teachers, we understand the requirements of curriculum sequencing. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We can see the steps along the way with the curriculum. I like to think about the work of Christine Council, for instance, who's talked about curriculum being a set of steps along a route, and that every step matters. So knowledge of the requirements of curriculum sequencing, the dependencies in relation to the content that we're teaching. But also it's about relevant curriculum tasks, assessments, activities, and then also crucially being able to have loads of different explanations. So you try and explain something in one way and a group of students, they still don't get it. So you need multiple ways, multiple representations. And also we need to know about common misconceptions. So for instance, teaching English, if you teach students the word flammable, for instance, students often have a misconception about the word inflammable. When you put that word, you give it the what's the term? Not precursor, but anyway, the in bit that comes before flammable. I forget what the terminology, but inflammable doesn't mean often what they think it means, because they apply the same rules of language to it. So knowing that this is a kind of common misconception that's coming up is one of those things that seemingly is associated with great teaching, because we can expect it, identify it, prepare for it, and teach around it. But let's go into a little bit of depth just on that second element around curriculum sequencing, just to exemplify it. Now, I was working with a group of teachers a while ago, thinking about how they develop algebraic fluency with their students. So this is in their curriculum document. It says students will learn how to develop algebraic fluency. But if we think about the curriculum as a set of steps along a learning journey, we think that every step matters. Well, what are the steps that perhaps needed to be taken before we get to this point of being fluent with algebra? And one of the conversations that I often have with teachers of mathematics is, well, students need to be really, really fluent with mental arithmetic. That's super important. So further down the sort of the left-hand side of my arrow there, further earlier on in this learning journey, mental arithmetic needs to have been one of those steps that has been taken securely, so that students have this kind of foundation when they come towards algebra and then developing fluency with algebra. And great teachers have a really strong understanding of the sequence within that curriculum and the kind of dependencies. In this instance, algebraic fluency is dependent upon students having a really strong grasp of mental arithmetic. So understanding the content is one of these important facets, these dimensions of highly effective teaching, one of the dimensions of great teaching. So let's assume then that we've got teachers who know their stuff. They really know the subject or subjects that they're teaching. That's one of the dimensions. The second is then to create a supportive environment in the classroom. And this is characterized by relationships of trust and respect and warmth and empathy. But it's also about an environment in which children feel that they're able to have a go. So this breaks down into these four broad areas. Let's look at these elements. The first is about teacher and student relationships. The teacher-student relationship is just so important. And the interactions that teachers have with students should be based upon mutual respect, upon care, empathy, warmth. And also from the teacher's perspective, great teachers avoid negative emotions, things like being sarcastic or doing things that might lead to a student feeling shame or guilt or humiliation. And they are also sensitive to individual student needs. So this is things like special educational needs, disabilities, but also culturally relevant teaching. So understanding the cultural backgrounds of individual students. And this is particularly important when the cultural background of the teacher may indeed come into conflict with that of the students that they teach. So the teacher-student relationship is really, really super important. And teachers themselves are the ones who are able to kind of manage the situation and to plan for it by understanding their students well and building relationships with them. But then number 2 gives us student-to-student relationships. Again, these are relationships that are characterized by respect and trust and cooperation and care. Teacher-student relationships are so important because students learn so much from one another. And if you're going to engage, for instance, in high-quality formative assessment, using, for instance, the wonderful work that Dylan William and Siobhan Leahy talks about, formative assessment strategies where we activate other students as learning resources for one another. Well, we need to have relationships that are strong and powerful for learning amongst our student body. Number 3 in this talks about learner motivation. And learner motivation we'll talk about in a little bit of depth in a moment. But there are these 3 kind of feelings that seem to be associated with self-determined motivation. And these are feelings of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And I'll say more about those in a moment. But number 4 in this dimension is then about a classroom in which every child experiences high expectations, right? That there is high challenge and high trust in the classroom environment. From the moment that they step in, the expectations are high no matter what. Expectations of behavior, of learning, of achievement, so that every student feels that it's okay to have a go, and that when they succeed or they fail, that they are able to attribute those things to things that they could change. A climate of high challenge and high trust is one of those characteristics of a classroom of great teachers. But let's go back to this idea of promoting learner motivation for a moment, because I think it's really interesting. And when we look at the research evidence around learner motivation, we can separate motivation out into 2 broad types. Firstly, autonomous motivation. Let's call it autonomous motivation, whereas a learner feels that they're doing things by their own volition, their own free will. And then we can contrast that with controlled motivation, where learners feel this pressure to think, feel, behave in certain ways. And one of the things that seems to be to come through from the research evidence around effective teaching is that promoting autonomous motivation through these feelings of competence and relatedness and autonomy seem to be really important. So if we think of self-determination theory, and there's some great work by 2 researchers, Ryan and DC, who've written a huge amount about self-determination theory. The feeling of self-determined motivation seems to occur when students feel these 3 these basic psychological needs are satisfied. Competence, that they feel that they can have a go at something, that they can succeed at something, that they know enough. They've got enough skill to have a go at a task, even if it's challenging. Autonomy, that they feel that they're making a choice, that they are doing things of their own volition, their own free will. And when I say choice, it's important to notice there's, for instance, some really interesting work that's been done on choice in the context of homework. And it's important to realize that the choice that is being offered here is not do the homework or don't do the homework. The choice is between 2 different homework tasks, each of which is valuable. But instead of just giving a homework task to children, we give them 2 and then ask them to choose. And it's just these small moments where students themselves are having to make a choice that can help to develop that feeling of autonomy. And there are loads of other examples, a lot of which we talk about inside the Great Teaching Toolkit. And then finally, relatedness. And this is about a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness with people who are important to you. And for most students, their teachers their peers are important to them. So having a sense of belonging with those people is again one of those kind of conditions, those feelings that needs to be satisfied in order to help to promote these feelings of learner motivation in the classroom. So I'm just going to pause now, just for the next 30 seconds, and just ask if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. There'll be another opportunity after we've looked at the next 2 dimensions of great teaching.
Hi, Stuart. There was a comment in the chat about knowing your content, and somebody picked up on how this is difficult in a primary context.
Yes.
With lots of different subjects, but it is obviously applicable with primary as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thanks for the comment there. I take my hat off to primary practitioners here, and I'm a chair of governors at a federation of primary schools, and I find it really, really hard to square away quite how primary teachers do it. And whatever the scale of the challenge, I think that what we always find is that whatever you're teaching, highly effective teachers really know their stuff. And so subject-specific professional development, I think, is really, really important there. Developing your subject knowledge. And I know that that's really hard when you're teaching so many different subjects, but this applies whether you are teaching early years, primary, secondary, further education, higher education. These are some of the common traits across teachers of all sorts.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, keep the questions coming in the chat, and I'll take some more later on. Look forward to those. Okay, let's move on. So we talked about 2 kind of dimensions of effective practice, 2 dimensions of great teaching. But in our model for great teaching, again, what we looked at and what we found coming through loud and clear from the research evidence is that great teachers maximize every single opportunity there is to learn. Now, in some kind of frameworks and systems, this would simply be called classroom management or behavior management, but that for us isn't quite enough. It doesn't get to the heart of the matter, because what we're thinking about here is that in schools we have lessons, we have opportunities when teachers are with students and there is an opportunity for those students to learn. And then, maybe during homework or other instances, there are other opportunities to learn. And this dimension is all about making the most of every single opportunity that's available. And, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds this because people have different styles of doing things, different values, different priorities. Some come from, what might be called a traditional approach, a progressive approach. But one thing that seems to transcend all of these differences is that effective teachers simply make the most of the time, the resources that they have available to ensure that the environment in the classroom is truly optimized for students' learning. So what does this mean then when we look at the details of these 3 elements of great teaching that we drew out? Well, the first is that every second counts, and that every resource, every instruction, everything is really fine-tuned to not waste any time for learning. So something as simple as giving instructions in a way that is really clear, really concise, so that students know exactly what to do. Great teachers also seem to use routines. So they teach these routines to students, for instance, classroom entry routines, or what to do during transitions, end of a lesson, handing in homework, whatever it might be. They don't leave it to chance. They teach these routines to students. But then element number 2 gives us something about the rules and expectations and consequences for behavior in the classroom. When children go to school, or students in high schools go to school, they are learning in a community, and they come together with a teacher and their peers often, and they share a space. And there are certain behaviors then that are more conducive to learning than others. For example, if a student is speaking an answer to a question, then a behavior that is helpful for learning is that other students don't speak over them. Now, when we think about rules and expectations and consequences for behavior, it's easy to get drawn into conversations about good behavior and bad behavior. And personally, I don't think that those are particularly helpful. For me, I like to think about behaviors that are either helpful for learning or not so helpful for learning. So let's remove the kind of good, bad judgment and then think, okay, if students engage in this particular behavior, is that likely to help them to focus their attention, to use their limited working memory resources, and to attend to the material that I need them to think hard about? So having these things set out, these rules and expectations and consequences for behavior, and teaching them, not telling them, but teaching these to students seem to be really important. But also making sure that they are consistently applied. That from classroom to classroom or classroom to corridor or whatever it might be, that students don't have to think about the differences in rules and expectations from one teacher to another or one context to another, that they're consistent. And this is important for fairness, but also for managing cognitive load. We don't want students having to think about the rules and expectations that seem to change depending on who their teacher is or the classroom in which they're working. And number 3 then is about the prevention, anticipation, responding to potentially disruptive incidents. And there are lots and lots of ways of doing this, but again, setting up a classroom where the relationships are good and where the expectations of behavior seem to be really clear and consistently applied. These are all kind of the background music to being able to prevent and anticipate potentially disruptive incidents. But the ways in which great teachers do this is that they try and basically catch the students doing something really, engaging in behavior that's helpful for learning, and they celebrate it. That they reinforce positive student behaviors by talking it into existence, by talking about how a student is doing the thing that they need them to do. For instance, when students come into the room, teachers might talk it up in ways of that draw attention to the positive behaviors, such as, it's great to see how Kayla has got her pens out now. It's brilliant. I love, and great to see how Sean's now working really hard on the reading task that we've got up on the board. That's brilliant. They talk it into existence, but they also signal awareness of what's happening in the classroom. And one of the things about effective teachers is they seem to have eyes in the back of their heads. And all students know that. And they signal their awareness through things such as just even a hand or a look. But students know that the teacher knows. And these are all well worth observing. If you ever go and look in another teacher's classroom, see what they do. One of my favorite ones was just to put my hand onto a student's desk. If they were perhaps off task, they were talking and they shouldn't have been, I might just stand next to the desk and put my hand on the desk just to signal, I know, I'm here, and then perhaps I don't need to do anything more about it, and that can simply prevent something that might have escalated. So a simple technique then that I've seen lots of teachers use for it to manage time and resources efficiently is always to have a do now activity at the start of a lesson. And this can benefit teachers in a range of different contexts, primary, secondary. Maybe you don't have your own classroom base to stay in during the course of the day. To have something that's really quick to get started so that no second is wasted when children are in there. And these do now activities, I think, are really effective when they are tightly focused on the curriculum content that you want children to be thinking hard about, and that learners can get on with it really quickly. It doesn't require them to log onto a website or to access something extraneous. They've got to be able to get on with it really quickly. But this is just one way in which highly effective teachers, I think, maximize every single opportunity. No second is wasted, and every child is learning right up to the very end of the scheduled lesson. So this takes us then to dimension 4. Now, I think of dimensions 1, 2, and 3 in some ways as kind of background music, if you like, to being able to do the things of dimension 4 really well. So if you're a teacher who really understands the content that you're teaching and how it's learned, and you know all of these great assessment tasks and learning activities and misconceptions, and you've got a classroom where you've got really great relationships with students, and students have great relationships with each other, students feel motivated, and that there's an environment of high expectations, high challenge, high trust, where we're maximizing every last opportunity with great learning activities, with rules, routines. Students can really focus on learning. Then we've created the conditions in which we can get them thinking hard about things. Learning is effortful, right? It's hard work. And some of the things that we ask our students to learn, they don't like, right? It's not, maybe it doesn't seem instantly appealing or interesting. So we have to find ways and use techniques to bring them into the subject and to get them to think really hard about things. Some years ago, my colleague Rob Coe wrote about learning from the perspective of the actions that students take in order to learn things. What was the kind of common underlying thread? And he said, learning happens when you think hard about something. And so what are the ways in which great teachers activate their students' thinking about the content that they want them to learn? And we can separate this out into 6 separate elements. And here are the first 3. So firstly, about structuring is about having this appropriate sequence of learning tasks, about having learning objectives that students understand and that are shared with them, and then scaffolding tasks so that we're meeting students where they are in terms of their prior knowledge, and then creating learning tasks that move them on from that starting point. So it's not a generic one-size-fits-all model. It's about ensuring that whatever prior knowledge students are coming with, we're building learning tasks on those foundations, so that that scaffolding that we put in place is gradually removed so that all students succeed. We've got high expectations, but maybe multiple different routes that each student is going to follow to reach that destination. The high expectations remain, but I, as a learner, perhaps require a different route to Kate or somebody else. But the crucial thing about scaffolding is you take it away. Element number 2 is about explanations. And good explanations build on prior knowledge. And they are concise, and they are engaging. They bring students in, they get them thinking really hard about things. And oftentimes, one of the neat ways that explanations work well is when we use examples and non-examples. We show what it looks like and what it doesn't look like in practice. But also great teachers use, as part of their explanations, models. They might model and demonstrate new skills and talk aloud as they're doing it. And this is one of the techniques that I've seen work really nicely, particularly when teachers are trying to help their students develop independent learning habits, something that we'll talk about in a little bit around metacognition. The use of worked examples, part-worked examples within explanations. Again, these are some of the characteristics that seem to be associated with effective explanations. But it's really important to notice that one size here doesn't fit all. A worked example is a great tool for a learner at a kind of novice, early stage of learning a new concept. But there's a weird effect that seems to happen as you develop greater expertise, greater knowledge and skill in an area. Worked examples can actually limit learning. They can constrain it because students can already do it themselves. They don't require the scaffolding that's there. So again, it kind of takes us back to that idea that a worked example, great tool, but if we keep using them and we don't take out the scaffolding that they provide, they can actually hamper, they can become an obstacle to learning. And number 3 is about questioning. Questioning for 2 kind of connected but distinct purposes. One is to promote thinking, to promote elaboration and connected, flexible thinking, right? So I'm asking these questions, well, why and what would happen if, and compare this and contrast this, but also then using questions in its assessment sense, using high quality assessment to generate evidence of learning that then teachers can interpret and respond to appropriately. So questioning is seen in great teaching from these kind of 2 perspectives. One, asking questions that get students to really think hard about the things that we want and to elaborate and develop connected, flexible thinking, but then also from its assessment point of view, to evidence learning, to give us a bit of an insight into this invisible world of learning. And it's important to remember that assessment really is the only tool that we've got available to us to understand what children have learned, and not just what we hope they've learned. So as an example then of using questioning to promote elaboration, this is quite a nice example. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a multiple choice question or a task here to then highlight what you think is the correct answer. So here's the question with the correct answer in green. But then on the right-hand side, on this grid, just an elaboration task. Can you add just a further detail to this? So here we might be using the multiple choice question to give us a small insight into whether they know a particular fact. But then on the right-hand side, we've got a question there that's designed to kind of engage a little bit of connected thinking, trying to develop some elaboration. So great teachers use questioning for these connected but distinct purposes, to promote hard thinking and elaboration and connected thinking, but also from its assessment perspective. And then the final 3 kind of areas, these elements of great teaching. Interacting is around feedback. So great teachers respond to feedback from students about their thinking, their knowledge, their understanding, but they also give feedback to students to guide their learning. And it's feedback that moves learning forwards, feedback that is comprehensive, is understandable by the student, and crucially, that the student is then going to use in order to do something differently. And oftentimes, one of the kind of defining features of great teachers when they give feedback is that they also then allow students time and space to respond to that feedback and to do something differently. So great teachers activate hard thinking. One of the ways is that they interact through feedback. They also, number 5, embed learning through practice tasks. And again, the use of practice tasks here is one of those characteristics of highly effective teachers, but these are practice tasks that are targeted at the right kind of pitch and level for a student given their prior knowledge and skill. We want them to be able to succeed at the practice task, but perhaps with a bit of effort. And these are practice tasks that embed and reinforce learning, where the student has to practice those skills until they're fluent and secure. So, and that fluency and secure nature of those skills is something that really all teachers are trying to, I guess, achieve with their learners. We want students to become independent and self-actualized. And how do we do that? Well, one of those ways is through practice, guided practice, distributed practice over time, where children are really focusing in on the core skills, the core knowledge that we need to learn. And then finally, number 6 is about activating. And we call this activating. Really, this is about self-regulation and metacognition. This is about helping students to become independent, self-actualized learners by teaching and then learning the skills of independent learners. And these are the skills of planning, of monitoring, evaluating our own learning. And great teachers do this within the context of the subject that they're teaching. So this isn't something that seems to work particularly effectively if you have a generic kind of study skills or how to learn session where you take children out of their normal classes and then put them in a room and do a study skills kind of session. What seems to be the case when we look at the research evidence on teaching these metacognitive skills is that they are best placed within subject lessons, so in the context of normal daily lessons, and that they are kind of a regular feature right the way through from early years onwards. And one of the ways that, again, that I've seen teachers do this really nicely is to help students to plan by modeling and thinking aloud, literally by talking through an example. Here's how I would do it. If it's, for instance, I used to teach English, as I said, and if it's something to do with writing an essay or writing an effective opening, I might say, okay, so I'm going to try this. And before I do this, I'm going to write myself just a little bullet point plan with a few key words that I want to use here, because I know that the last time I did this, I forgot to include these things. So here's my plan. I'm going to write this up, and I actually do it and I talk it through as I'm doing this. And then I might provide a practice opportunity for students to say, okay, now you've seen one and I've talked through my example, you have a go at one, and so on. And then we get into using feedback and what have you. But simply talking aloud, modeling, explaining your thinking is one way that we can take the expertise that you have as a teacher and then make it visible to students. And students are trying to develop the expertise that you have, and just simply by talking it out and making it visible, this is one of the ways that we can develop these really important metacognitive skills. But I can't underscore this enough. Most teachers are trying every day to help their students to develop independence as learners. And that really should start as early as we possibly can to developing these skills of planning, monitoring and evaluating your own learning in the context of the specific subjects and content that we're teaching. So I'm going to pause again before we talk about what school leaders can do to help improve their practice very briefly. Then we'll take questions for the last few minutes.
We've had some great questions.
Super.
Yeah. Jerry asked about, when you were talking about questioning, what about encouraging great questions from the students to the teacher? This is something that he says he doesn't see enough, or perhaps we don't talk about.
Yeah, I think this is a great technique, but to ask a good question, it's really important. You've got to have something to work with as a student. So I'd say we need both to ensure that we're teaching the content that we want them to use in their questions, but also teach them how to ask a really good question. Again, model it, show them, but then expect to use that as part of the practice. It's a great one, I think, in terms of activating learners as resources for one another. If a student can ask a really, really well-focused question to their peer, that could be a powerful learning tool that helps to distribute the task across an entire class. I think it's a really good idea, but if nobody's ever taught you how to ask a good question, don't be surprised if you don't ask the best question that you could.
Yeah, and another great question from Jonas. It links in with something you said previously. Shall I understand dimension 1 to 3 as necessary prerequisites for dimension 4?
Well, this is a great question, and I'm going to say that I think they are. In that, I think of dimension 4 as being, those are the kind of classroom, those are the day-to-day things of the classroom of, asking questions, explaining ideas, practice, things like that. But they tend to work more effectively, I think, when you have a well-managed environment where you're not suddenly having to think, okay, where are my resources? What PowerPoint am I using? What textbook? Where are the textbooks? And you're not also facing the battle of poor quality relationships within the classroom. So I think, and I think, I'm willing to for somebody to disagree with me, but dimensions 1, 2, and 3, I think of as the those are the foundations on which you can then build amazing explanations, really challenging questions, high expectations for practice, and so on. I think it's harder to do all of those things if dimensions 1, 2, and 3 are not really solid.
Yeah, and a question I'll just answer is, a lot of people have asked, are you getting the recording? Yes, everyone who's here, or people who couldn't make it, everyone will be sent the recording.
Definitely.
Via email this week. And there was another question from Chris. What about when students are wrong with an answer? He said he'd love some advice about how to encourage students to be resilient. And that is tricky when they volunteer or you select a student and then they get it wrong.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things there. One is perhaps about modeling this for yourself. So showing, what you have done in the past, giving examples of when you've got things wrong and how you have used those. So again, if we think that the teacher is an important person in a student's life, to be able to see clearly how they've handled a similar situation, I think, is really helpful. Secondly, one of the ways in which I think we can help students to be a bit more resilient is to build it up by reducing the stakes, right? So we should have high expectations for students, right? We shouldn't lower our expectations, but we should recognize that as we, any student moves along that journey towards, achieving highly and doing really well, that things are going to go wrong. So along the way, when we're asking questions, we want the consequences of getting it right or getting it wrong not to be, super high, because it's then that students start to become anxious, start to feel that there is some kind of really, really weighty consequence to getting it right, getting it wrong. What we want to do is create an environment where every answer is a worthwhile answer, because it either points towards, it's always going to point towards the next step in learning. So it's either going to point towards, well, we move on to this, or maybe it points towards we need to revisit something. So creating a culture of questioning in your classroom where the stakes are always pretty low can be done as easily as, taking away, grading from questions that you might ask if those are used, or indeed, with students who perhaps seem underconfident or might be shy or reticent, instead of asking the question across the whole classroom, ask it to them, quietly, one-to-one. So we shouldn't change our expectations, but we should change the ways in which we approach different students in different ways, acknowledging that if we know our students really well and we have that strong sense of connection with them, that strong relationship, then we could try to mitigate some of those kind of adverse consequences. But I acknowledge that developing resilience is one of the things that I hear a lot in schools at the moment, and nobody likes to get things wrong. But I would say that in a classroom, teachers can do an awful lot to create a supportive environment where actually, if you get it wrong, that is seen as an indication of next steps in learning. Every answer is always about the next steps in learning.
Yeah, and there's another question here that's really interesting. And is it helpful to explain the why of your teaching technique, why you're encouraging hard thinking, and how can we as teachers do that well? Yeah.
Personally, I think yes. And I think that I've seen this done in lots and lots of different ways in many different classrooms. But what underlines all of it is, or underpins all of it, is that teachers are trying to make much clearer, much more explicit the process of learning, and then why they're doing things in the way that they're doing. So, for example, why am I asking questions, right? If I explain that the answers to questions help me to work out how best to support you as a student, then that gives a rationale that is very different to I'm making a judgment of you, I'm ranking you, I'm evaluating you. So, and I would model, okay, now that I've asked these questions, I now understand that we can move on to this next topic. So that's what we're going to do. Or I might adapt what we're going to do in the next lesson just to respond to what we found. So I think basically opening up this kind of black box of our teaching to talk about why we're choosing certain tasks and activities, I think is really sensible. And particularly where these things are kind of counterintuitive for students. So there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest, for instance, that cramming the night before a test is less effective than distributing your kind of practice and your preparation over time and constantly revisiting, retrieving information and securing and preparing in that way. But what do most students do? Most it seems intuitive that you would just try and build it up, do it all the night before, and then see what happens. So sometimes just explaining the evidence behind it, why we're going to keep on revisiting certain topics lesson by lesson, I think could be really powerful. I once saw a teacher do this in her lessons. She would ask 3 questions, generally around the start of the lesson. One of the questions would be about the current topic, one question about the previous topic, and one from a topic from last year. And initially students were kind of, they were shocked and they didn't really know why they were doing this, but she explained why. And she also explained the evidence behind it. She kind of brought that out into the open. And it created an environment where students understood a little bit more about the kind of the craft, the black box of teaching. It was opened up and a light was shone on it. And I think that's really beneficial.
Yeah. And another example is cold calling, where the teacher picks a student. Now, if you decide, oh, I'm going to do cold calling because I've read about it, these are the reasons why it's effective, but we don't explain to the students, then they could get these misconceptions. Why is Miss Jones picking on me all of a sudden? She used to ask for hands up and now she'll just ask me a question. But if I explain it really clearly and the reasons why I'm doing this, it's not to trick you, catch you out, make you feel uncomfortable. The reasons are because I want to hear from everyone in the class. And then that, like you said, helps lower the stakes. The children are more involved, they understand. So I totally agree with you there. And I write a lot about retrieval practice, and I always say, talk to students, talk to parents, explain that. There is a question from Paula, but I just, Paula's asked, what are your thoughts on playful pedagogy? But there's a lot of people here from around the world. We've got people from America. Playful pedagogy, I know, is a term specific really with Scotland. But that links in, Stuart, with what you were saying. For anyone who's unaware of the playful pedagogy or the Scotland Play Charter, you've already, I think, touched upon key elements: students learning from one another, talking to each other, interacting with each other. And actually they can have that opportunity from a young age, but they should still do that. Peer group work has a bit of a bad rep, doesn't it?
It does. But I think I'm fond of using what my former supervisor, Steve Higgins, would call the Bananarama principle. Bananarama, for anybody who doesn't know, it was a pop group in England from the 1980s, I think. And one of their most popular songs was called "It Ain't What You Do, It's the Way That You Do It." And so, group work, like anything, could be effective or it can be ineffective. It's not necessarily what you do, it's the way that you do it. And there are certain kind of active ingredients, certain key ingredients there that seem to make it more effective than others. And so it's worth, always investigating, always go down, and asking the question, why? Why is this thing likely to be effective? What are the components of it? What are the things that I really need to make sure are in there so that we avoid, lethal mutations, we avoid doing things in ways that don't achieve the effects that they could do simply by not quite getting the kind of the key active ingredients of those. So group work and playful pedagogy, it's not necessarily what you do. I think it's the way that you do it that's likely to achieve the desired effects.
I agree. Jump one more question. There's been a lot in the chat. CC's asked, should students be allowed to redo high stakes assessments after teacher feedback? So I assume this is, if it's high stakes, it's more of a summative type of assessment.
So I think in schools, I don't actually believe that there are any summative assessments in schools. I think exam boards and governments and others have summative assessments when they award grades and so on. I think in schools, all assessments really are serving formative purposes. And sometimes I think it's wholly appropriate for students to have another go. And take for instance, if I came to your school as a student and I did a test and I was just having a really bad day, I got a horrible cold, I just had an argument with my mum on the way into school. Maybe actually you won't get a good picture of what I know and can do on that day, and maybe I could have another go at it. But I think there's a balance here, and the balance is all about opportunity cost. The more testing we do, the less teaching we do. So my view is that we, when it comes to particularly what you think of as perhaps high stakes or summative tests, that we keep the number of those down. We embrace the kind of the unreliability of them. We don't use them in ways that create anxiety and fear amongst our students. So having the option, the ability to redo things can be really helpful. But I think I would argue more that it's important to reduce the stakes of testing in schools and to create conditions in which really all testing is seen as having a formative purpose, because actually that's what schools are for. National exams or qualifications and things like that perform a summative purpose, and really for most schools the kind of control over those is totally out of their hands.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, so we'll finish just on a last little bit, and there's a couple of links that I want to share with people here. So no teacher is an island, right? You're not doing this all on your own. You will be working in some form in some kind of community. And often if you're working in a school or a college, then your improvement is in some ways dependent upon the actions of leaders. So my question is, well, what are the things that school leaders can do? And just last year, we published another review, which was on school environment and leadership, the factors that seem to affect student outcomes, and crucially affecting the ways in which teachers can perform at their very best. Even the best teacher is going to struggle if the classroom, if the school environment and the leadership in the school is ineffective. And when we did that, what we found was that classroom teaching, definitely the top priority for any school leader. This is the thing that seems to make the most difference, the quality of classroom teaching. But that practice, it can be constrained or supported by the environment in which people are working. And so leaders should focus on the things that seem to support learning, students learning, the barriers and the enablers to it. And one of the things that has been coming through quite clearly from discussions around the characteristics that seem to be associated with students who learn more, is that in those schools, as represented by this green line by work published by John Pape and Matt Kraft, that one of the things you'll see there point to is around professional development, that teachers who have time and resources allocated for professional development that really enhances their instructional abilities. It's not just any professional development, but it's focusing on the quality of classroom practice. That's one of those characteristics of teachers who seem to get better over time. And others, not so much. And so it's not just about teachers trying to be better individually, but teachers working within the context of the school, and leaders and other colleagues can do things that make it more likely for the best teachers to be even better than they currently are. And so finally then, let's draw today to a close, this webinar to a close, by looking at just a couple of resources that I hope will be of use to you. So the first is this: if you are working with colleagues in your school or college, wherever you are, we've created a Developing Great Teaching workshop pack. So if you're running a training session with a group of colleagues of any size, we've done all of the work for you to put together a 2-hour training pack workshop that does these things that you can see on the screen. And it goes through the Great Teaching Toolkit and then gets people to a point of thinking about, well, what are our goals? What are our improvement priorities? So that's one. The other is this, a free resource library, which is absolutely stacked out with really, really great useful content. So you'll find in there short courses, blogs, webinars, podcasts, ebooks, all kinds of stuff in there that hopefully you'll find of use. So take a snap of that QR code, then we will draw it to a close. I will say now, if you have questions, I'm happy to keep going. We've had quite a few already, but I'm happy to answer more questions now.
I've just put links in the chat for the resource library, the inset pack, and the evidence reviews. Not that your QR codes didn't work; they were brilliant, Stuart. But just anyone who's not quite into their QR codes,
You are a wonderful colleague. Thank you.
And we can put the links out when we send the recording as well.
Sure. Are there any other questions that you think I should address now?
Lots of people thanking you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you all very much for coming.
Very international, Stuart. Peru, America, across the UK.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Great. That's wonderful.
Thailand as well.
Oh, that's really nice.
Well, great teaching is great teaching, isn't it? It's global. It's
wherever you are. Yeah, and it's lovely that people are keen to find out more. I think that's great.
Australia and Czech Republic as well. Send their thanks.
Oh, amazing. Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go. Oh, look at that. Spreading the word at my school every day.
I will.